Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the JCQ for tonight's Taekwon Conversation. My name's Tim Callan. I'm the Director of Taekwon Arts, and I'm really thrilled to welcome everybody here tonight. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have as our guest online from Sydney the renowned architect Dr. Peter Tonkin, who is one of the founding partners of Tonkin Zulaikha Greer, a firm which was established in 1987 and which has an inspirational catalogue of major projects, many of which have been the design of cultural facilities like galleries, museums and performing arts spaces. Many of them have been, in fact, revitalising heritage buildings. And tonight, Peter is going to share with us an incredibly exciting project which, in fact, brings together both of these fields of expertise in which TZG specialises, which is the Walsh Bay Arts Precinct in Sydney. I'd like to welcome Peter Tonkin from Sydney. Peter, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and welcome to the JC Cube, if only online.
This is a project we've been working on since 2016 and is only just now getting to the stage where we can look at the end of it. And it's been involved a very large number of people in our office, as well as expert consultants in all sorts of fields, from heritage to building services to marine engineering and, of course, theatre and acoustics. The project is sponsored by the New South Wales Government, delivered by a branch of government called Infrastructure New South Wales, which is chartered with kind of developing things for the government. The immediate client is Create New South Wales, which is the Ministry for the Arts. And missing from this slide, but it should be there, is the builder Richard Crooks Construction, who are a partner in the whole process and deeply involved with delivery and managing the design aspects at the construction side. Here we can see the site of Walsh Bay in red. It's a shallow bay at the north end of the Sydney CBD. It links around to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, you can see with its shadow on the water, and Circular Quay at the bottom with the 6 ferry wharves, and the Opera House further on. And you can see the tall buildings of the Sydney CBD there at the bottom, and the kind of sweep of parkland that runs almost the entire length of the CBD to the east over here. And Walsh Bay itself, which at present is fairly remote and isolated, will, when this metro station comes live, be very much more connected with the fabric of the city. And as part of that connection, you can see here in blue what's been termed by a collaboration between the Sydney City Council and the New South Wales Government, the cultural ribbon. And that stretches from the Barangaroo Headland Park here, which has a cultural space, through Walsh Bay, around the foreshore to the Museum of Contemporary Art, Customs House, the Sydney Opera House, and off the picture to the south, the Art Guide of New South Wales and the Australian Museum. And these major sweep of cultural institutions are then linked by what potentially can be one of the great, foreshore promenades through a city and against the harbour. This interesting map shows the resumption of land along the foreshore for what was called the Sydney Harbour Trust's improvement scheme for Darling Harbour.
And what year was that approximately? Do you have a...
It was resumed in the early 1900s, I can't be exact, following the outbreak of bubonic plague in Sydney. And the government stepped in and swept up all the old properties and started thinking, well, how can we make a cleaner, more efficient 20th century instead of a 19th century city out of Sydney? Ramshackle, slapped together, richly textured and interesting in the way that Victorian cities were, dominated by industry and the very steep fall of land down to the water's edge. This very interesting city redevelopment scheme, a kind of urban project on a grand scale, didn't just look at the way of improving the efficiency of Sydney's trade, which was even then the backbone of its success, but looked at how they would house workers. So there was a large amount of workers' housing built, a port railway developed. The scheme stopped here at Pier as they ran out of money in the mid-20th century. But all of this was built as, I guess, one of the most advanced pieces of maritime engineering in the world at the time. If you look at this slide, it gives you a much more realistic view of the wharves at their height, probably about 1930, with a large number of mostly Pacific trade and Australian coastal trade vessels. The really big vessels still tied up at Circular Quay or further around Darling Harbour. But this was a very busy mixed passenger ship here, passenger and cargo for the rest of them.
So that whole precinct was a very mixed purpose. It was about import and export of goods, but also
import and export of goods, passengers, everything.
But this was at a time when there was largely steamships coming in. This was designed and built sort of around the First World War up to the early 20s.
Correct, right? Correct. And built from about 1920 to about 1925 in various different stages. And as you say, very much for after the sail era, steamships or turbines at the time.
But before the advent of the container ship.
In fact, the containers spelled the end of Walsh Bay because the wharves did not suit containerisation. The very fine design of these buildings had a very short-lived period as a shipping wharf. But because they were remote from the city and out of the development pressure, they just sat there and no one did anything until in the 80s, the Sydney Theatre Company, which was based in a very small theatre in the inner southern city, decided they wanted to build themselves a new theatre in the wharf. And so these grand spaces, which had lain empty for so long, here you can see the lower shed, about 6.5 metres floor to floor on a 6 by 6 metre grid.
So, and just maybe I could just explain, Peter, that each of the wharves comprised two levels. So this is the lower level, and then there's an equivalent level above, not quite the same height clearance. Is that right?
And you'll note the very strong back so-called structures, which has steel trusses to reinforce the timber members to give us an amazingly high load-bearing capacity in these wharves, which we turn to our advantage. So here we'll look at it in a bit more detail. Pier 4-5 at the top, the so-called shore sheds built on the seawall here, Pier 2-3 at the bottom. And what we were dealing with was a mix of 6 different cultural arts tenants. Here we can see the two-level structure that Tim mentioned to you. The strong back beams are very clear here at the lower level and timber trusses on the upper level. Originally, this was a roof valley and the 2 trusses were supported by a column, but fairly extensively along the length of the wharves. We took advantage of the fact that you couldn't see this infill to remove the centre column, provide much more spanning structure in the terms of steel reinforcing to the timber trusses to provide clear span spaces at this upper level for the 3 major performance spaces in 2-3 and the very large theatre that was built for Sydney Theatre Company in 4-5. Here you can see a section which is a bit more typical. It shows you the 2 trusses and the valley in situ, the very lovely daylight roof lanterns that sit at the top of each gable. And clear, I think, in this slide, even if it's not particularly explained, is the very difficult juggling that we had to fit all of the different spaces required within this robust and beautiful but quite constrained structure. Everybody had been so deeply in love with the vast scale and cathedral-like beauty of this timber structure that we kept roughly a quarter of the wharf empty and went to a great deal of care, which I'll go through in the future of this talk, to maintain a sense of the original openness throughout the building. Bangara's function space on the end of 4-5, we were allowed, as part of the conservation works, to remove a limited amount of the original timber-framed weatherboard cladding, because of course this was all blank when it was a cargo shed, provided we retained the major structure, as much of the original infill as we could, and kept this kind of very dramatic and beautiful checkerboard pattern that the facades always had, so that panels of solid and panels of glass alternate and give you this rhythm to the facades. So this also shows the retained timber floor and how we preserved all the bits and pieces that were left within the wharf, some of which I'll show in a bit more detail later on. This shows you the ground floor foyer in 2-3, the piece that was coloured orange in the plan. This has a dramatic 6 metre wide steel staircase as a sort of rich architectural promenade for the audience to go from the ground level, entry level, up to the upper level foyer. The building that this foyer does too, so that very much left everything in situ and the kind of richly patinated timber and steel structure. Here's that foyer from an upper level, and this doesn't really illustrate it because it's a complete optical illusion, but what we have done throughout this building is clad the heavily insulated and air-conditioned boxes that are the spaces where performances occur or people work, and they are boxes set back from the facade so that we could leave the facade intact, and then above the level of that cladding we've put mirror so that there'll be this optical illusion that this rich and beautiful ceiling goes on forever in the way that it did before we intervened with our new uses.
So this is the space that was basically left, pretty much in its original condition for this kind of flexible use.
Yes. So we've got glass doors where the cargo doors have been fixed open here. They can be slid back to blackout again. Heaters, no air conditioning because...
I'm just trying to get a reaction from the Hong Kong public. No air conditioning, that's okay?
No air conditioning. Because the Australian energy rules would have meant we would have had to heavily insulate the whole building. Yep. And that, of course, would have meant covering up all the beautiful original surfaces, and we would have been left with a room of plasterboard instead of a room of timber. Yeah. Get a bit of genuine atmosphere and real history. Yeah. And because we can open up the doors on either side, and it's right on the water, there are excellent breezes. We did full thermal modelling, and we're kind of saved by the high ceilings and the cross ventilation. But yes, it's not something that would happen, I think, in many other places in the world. This is the Australian Chamber Orchestra's function room, probably the space that was most difficult in the whole building to design. The management, and particularly their chairman of the board, insisted that we be able to get a harbour view from this space. And of course, when you have helicopters and foghorns outside the building, the level of sound control is therefore extraordinary, so that to get glass that provides not only the level of sound control, but doesn't present a disturbing echo to fine chamber music, was a really, really major exercise in this space. And we'll see a bit more of it. This is a space I'm particularly excited by in the building. The audience sees themselves in the space, and the actors are surrounded by the audience, and because of that, you get this amazingly powerful interaction and symbiosis between the players and the audience. And we thought that was particularly important for young kids who really need to see the effect they're having on the audience and get their charge of energy from that audience while they're playing. Here are some shots of Pier 4-5 as it's virtually finished. So a new front entrance to Hickson Road, stairs up to the Sydney Theatre Company and the wharf promenade to the various other uses beyond. Integrated signage throughout. There will be electronic signage that tells you what's happening in these blank squares. So this is really a provisional opening. Sydney Dance Company there. Entrance to all their studios. This is Bangarra Dance Theatre's big rehearsal come performance space. On the very first performance they had as a kind of VIP opening about 2 to 3 months ago.
So Peter, can I ask, is that originally, did that studio have a column kind of roughly where the dancer is standing? Is it?
This one did not have columns, but what required us to rebuild it almost in its entirety was the big beams you can see running across the top were all new, required to support the concrete structures to soundproof the Sydney Theatre Company above.
Yeah.
And no one realised quite how much rebuilding was going to happen in these spaces, but they wound up with a much improved space with new air conditioning and proper acoustics. New windows where we needed to, the heritage facade conserved and repainted. Elements like this rail that used to have the sliding gantries travelling along it remained and painted, and our new gantries, which of course no longer slide, alas. And this is it lit up at night, 4/5, and giving us a sense, I think, of how vibrant and exciting when those two wharves are completed. 2-3 is not as finished. Expected completion is the end of the year. Here is the Australian Theatre for Young People's seating bank. It's air conditioned from below, so we don't have too much ducts up above. It's much more energy efficient that way. Concrete floor slab with to soundproof and fire rate the theatre, with resilient mounts for a sprung timber floor. And above us is the lighting grid, which is a suspended tension wire structure, which was easier to thread through the heritage trusses, which you can see the bottom chord of one truss there. And again, we removed a column to create this. The column removal was the major heritage issue that we had, and the thing that needed the most argument through the conservation bodies, because of course the once you've removed them, they're very difficult to return back to an earlier state. The timber, we tried to reuse it as much as possible, but it was so hard and so old that it was more difficult to cut up than steel, and therefore phenomenally expensive to reuse in any way. Yeah. But we have managed to find places that are very prominent where we can reuse the bits of timber. This is the shared foyer again, with the new steel stair, which will be clad in mirror. The back wall will have metal cladding up to a datum and then mirror above, and that will reflect this fabulous rich array of steel structure and timber elements that really give the wharf its amazingly special character. This is the nutshell, the Bell Shakespeare. In course of production, you can see again resilient mounts for a suspended sprung floor, and the first of 3 layers of acoustic lining here to get the required sound control in that space. This is a shot up in the lantern, and these lanterns typically have been reglazed to get soundproofing and daylight, and where they're in performance spaces, we have provided automated blackout blinds up in that high level. This is the ACO's performance space, where we originally, of course, the roof went down. You can see the line of those.
Yeah, this is maybe we could just spend a moment taking a look at that, because there's a kind of if you look at the roof truss, there's a V shape in the middle.
So the V shape is where a valley came down, and at the bottom of that, just to the left of the yellow man hoist, there was a column. And so we removed 2 columns for this space, and then lifted the roof in the middle there. It's come back again to gain as much as possible of acoustic volume for this performance space.
Yeah. Talk about some of the challenges of addressing the different art forms that you were charged to accommodate.
Building was all over the place in terms of level, and we set out our drawings from a level we thought was reasonable. We had a point cloud survey of the whole thing. But as it turned out, there wasn't enough room for the 150 mil concrete slab to soundproof this space. So it wound up with a 32 mil solid sheet steel floor, fully welded on acoustic mounts, which are incredibly difficult piece of construction.
From my own experience, the Walsh Bay was always this sort of rather incomplete part of Sydney's cultural infrastructure, because only one of the wharves had been converted, and it was, that in itself, that was, when was that? In the late 80s, was it? Pier 4-5?
Yeah, 88 it opened.
Yeah.
And then the two dance companies moved in very temporarily in the 90s.
One of the big aspirations for this whole precinct was to bring together a critical mass of arts organisations to really establish it as a proper cultural precinct. And it always, until recently, has felt sort of halfway there, and this is the finishing piece of it. What do you think will be some of the things that will flow from this amazing bringing together of so many? I just wrote down the list. There's the Sydney Theatre Company, Bangarra Indigenous Dance Company, Sydney Dance Company, Australian Theatre for Young People, the Song Company, the Sydney Philharmonia Choirs, Bell Shakespeare, and the Australian Chamber Orchestra, all in this location, all with their own kind of purpose-built spaces. How do you think that's going to kind of influence the cultural scene?
Many of them have been in such ad hoc or substandard facilities. I think on the one hand, they'll suddenly get a real shot in the arms in terms of, hey, we matter. We've got funding, we've got beautiful spaces, we're not buried away anymore, we're front and centre. And I think it will lead them all to be a little bit more adventurous and a little bit more overt in the way they interact with the public. I think they're all very keen to start talking to one another and program in a way that they can utilise each other's venues and start to have almost prom concerts where you move from one to another around the waterfront.
Yeah.
And there are already Sydney events that have been in Walsh Bay in a fairly kind of, again, very ad hoc manner. So Sydney Writers Festival, which is one of the biggest writers' festivals in the world, now will have 8 state-of-the-art venues to run their lectures, events and programs across the whole of Walsh Bay. The Sydney Biennale, which is the city's kind of premier modern art event, which always used to use the empty 2-3, but with no facilities, whatever, will still use the raw function space, but now has a whole range of other spaces which they can collaborate with the other companies to use, so that you start to look at that kind of cultural collaboration and synergy. And of course, not very far away is the Rosalind Packer Theatre, Sydney Theatre Company's other theatre across the road in Hickson Road, and the Sydney Opera House itself, where many of these companies also perform, so that you're getting this focus on the harbour and culture and heritage and fine architecture right in the heart of the city. And I think it's something that doesn't exist in many other places in the world, and which, particularly in Walsh Bay, because those buildings are so unique to Sydney.
What are some of the distinct challenges that have come up? You've got a whole lot of different art forms there accommodated in a building that was never intended for that purpose. So you've had to reconcile all of that. What were some of the particular challenges?
The acoustics was fiendish, really, I'd have to say, but and soaked up a lot of money. And in a way, it's all hidden. Because you can't see it. There's no architecture to the acoustics. It's just all to do with eliminating unwanted noise as much as producing the right noises internally. And so that was a challenge. Managing the other architects in Sydney Theatre Company who kept moving toilets, so we had to cope with their pipes dropping down through inconvenient places underneath. That was very difficult. Yeah. I think it's just the complexity of nearly 100-year-old timber buildings over water. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, it's a high degree of difficulty.
Yes, but I mean, the good thing about creative clients is they are used to that show must go on mentality. So they're used to problem solving. They're used to sitting down and nutting out the answer rather than, making difficulties and being negative about it all. So almost to a person within those companies, they were fabulous to work with, inspirational in what they wanted.
Yeah. I remember that in the early planning stages, a lot of the companies were particularly keen to expand their educational programs and to be able to run daytime activities for students, etc. And it struck me just looking at that fly through. I remember going to a talk a few years ago by Clive Gillinson, who's the executive director of Carnegie Hall in New York, and Clive's great, is a great music educator, and he would always come back to this fundamental concept of offering inspirational experiences in inspirational places. And I think just looking at this and seeing how amazing it would be for school kids to come in and get their first taste of of an orchestra or a dance company in one of those spaces, I think could be life-changing.
Yes. Well, Sydney theatre companies had a bit of a children's engagement program. They do run education events. Sydney dance companies consistently running dance classes. But I think all of them together will suddenly, as you say, it's be so much more accessible. All in one place, they can do a whole day program with groups of school kids and take them from one theatre to the other, from the front of house where they'll see performers performing to the back of house where they can see how the sets are made, how the costumes are made, what the lighting is like up on the grid, all that kind of thing. It is magic going backstage.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real, one of the real inspirations of Walsh Bay is the fact that it unites that backstage and front stage experience.
Well, I think just based on what we saw in your presentation, virtually every company has a window looking into their rehearsal space. So it is all very much kind of available for public view, and I think that's something that is a fairly contemporary concept, because previously there was this always this idea that you'd keep the rehearsal process invisible, but I think increasingly,
well, not just the rehearsal, it's the workshops often have work windows so that you can
see the sets and costumes,
watch people slice up bits of wood. And I think, it's that whole thing of people are fascinated by the mechanics of production. They love to see what goes on behind the scenes and how things are made. Quite different to the middle 20th century notion of hiding all of that and just presenting this glossy finished product. And I think Walsh Bay is really a testament to that, that kind of new approach to cultural production.
Peter, I think you've inspired a whole lot of people here in Hong Kong to put Walsh Bay on their itinerary next time they're in the Southern Hemisphere. And we hope that you'll put Tai Kwun on your itinerary when you next are able to travel. I would love to welcome you here. This has been a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight. It's been really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.